Well, and then her husband came home. Dang, I've never run so hard in my life. Yeah, well, look, I got some folks here I got to talk to, okay? I'll call you back. Thank you. It's been a long time. You bet. Okay. Hey there. My name is Ed Whitchurch, Big Ed Whitchurch, hay salesman extraordinaire. You know, I spent half my life talking on this telephone. I bet I've sat there in that chair and probably sold a 500,000 tons of hay talking on this thing. These are handy devices. You know, in fact, if they could ever figure out how to get rid of the cord on this thing, so like you could take it on the truck with you, boy, that would be a handy device. I bet I could sell 1,000 of those. Let me properly introduce myself. My name is Daniel Edgar Whitchurch, born August the 22nd, 1917, Wagner, Oklahoma. Now you may be asking yourself, what's a boy from Oklahoma doing buried up here in Humboldt County? Well, folks, I got a good story for you. Gather round. And have you ever noticed how most really good stories always start out with, well, we've been drinking? Kind of the story of my life. You see, let me take you back in time to July 1936, Wagner, Oklahoma. I was in my favorite watering hole one evening and, well, I had been drinking. There was a young cowboy down at the end of the bar. He was apparently been overserved and he was bragging about how tough he was. Well, folks, there ain't nobody tougher than Big Ed Whitchurch with 8 beers in his belly. Yeah, I'm proud to say he wasn't nearly as tough as he bragged about that evening. Well, I won the fight, but doggone, the sheriff gave me the choice of either going to jail or getting out of town. Well, I chose option 2, and later that night I went home and explained my predicament to my parents. I was getting run out of the state, and they said I couldn't leave Oklahoma unless I took them with me. You see, it was 1936, and the whole country was in a depression. Nobody had any money. It was hotter than hell, and it hadn't rained in Oklahoma in over 2 years. And that's a hard road to hoe when you're a hay salesman. Well, that very night, we talked and figured out our plan, and we decided we'd all move to California, the land of opportunity. And the very next morning, we piled everything we owned into that family hay truck, and we headed west. We landed in a little town called Westmoreland, down in Southern California. And it was in that little town that I met and married my little bride, little Miss Betty Tucker. Oh, she was a cute little gal. She stood about 4'11", little Indian gal. Best damn cook in all of California. About the only thing she did better than cooking was taking care of me. You see, we had 11 children together. She was a tolerant woman. She stayed at home and raised the kids, and I was a traveling salesman, went all over Southern California, buying and selling, delivering hay, stopping at all the watering holes along the way. Well, that lasted for a couple years until we got run out of Westmoreland. Well, I had been drinking this particular evening, and I saw this old fellow walking down Main Street. He owed me some money for a load of hay I'd sold him a month or so ago, and he'd been dodging my calls. Well, I reached in my pickup truck. I grabbed my shotgun, put 2 shells in there, and then I kind of crouched down behind the cab of the truck as he was walking by Main Street. As old Whistle Britches crossed over by it, I raised up. I called out his name. Blam, blam. I fired off 2 shots. I didn't mean to hurt the man. I just wanted to get my money. Well, I got my money, but the outcome that day was that the sheriff suggested I take my hay business down the road along with my bad habits. Betty and I gathered up the kids. We headed to Stockton, and that lasted for a couple years, but doggone, if I didn't keep running into these police officers that just seemed to have a sour attitude about hay salesmen. Well, after 2 years of that, we just decided to get the hell out of the valley and move north. Ended up in Arcata, a little old college town. Way too tame for my taste. I like the rambunctiousness of Fortuna. See, this was a timber town. It was full of guys just like me. Loggers and dairymen and ranchers and cowboys, millwrights, sawyers. They were just as tough as me, and it was in this little community that my hay business really took off. You see, everybody in the Eel River Valley bought Whitchurch hay. Oh, it was a heck of a deal. Hey, do you remember the '64 flood? That little town of Ferndale was cut off from the rest of the world when the bridges went down. The only two things that got across the river was the U.S. mail and Whitchurch hay. We took care of our customers. That was the most important thing. It was a family operation. Even had my grandsons working for me. Old Leonard and little Ed, who's actually bigger than me, and then the little man, old Patrick. I tell you what, I love this town. Have you ever wondered why and how this got to be known as the Friendly City? See, by my way of thinking, it would be because this is the first town and only town in California that hadn't run the Whitchurches out for drinking and fighting. Well, folks, it's cocktail time. Y'all have a great afternoon and a very pleasant day. I got some calls to make. Ladies and gentlemen, it's sure good to be up here getting some fresh air today. My name is Fred Pollard, and I've got quite a story to tell you. Family came out here in 1889 when I was 2 years old. You see, I'd been born in the great state of Maine. You might say I was a maniac. I moved out here when I was 2 years old. See, Dad was a logger, and I later became a logger, and Brother Ethan, he was a logger also. Like a lot of folks moving out here at that time, we had our eyes set on these giant redwood trees. We aimed to make a whole bunch of money doing it. You're probably asking yourself, well, what's so special about a logger? This whole place is full of loggers, isn't it? Well, it is, but you may not realize this, but you're looking at a genuine, bona fide Humboldt hero. Let me tell you how it happened here. It was 1927, February the 8th, I believe. It was a cold and blustery day. Brother Ethan and I were out there on the Eel River fishing for steelhead. It was a cold day and the river was running about 12 feet. Mighty fast, and we were out there in his little boat. Pretty common at that time to see redwood stumps floating down the river all the time. What was unusual this particular day, we saw a fella hanging onto a redwood stump, flailing his arms, bobbing up and down. Why, we did what any self-respecting person would do. We put our fishing gear away and put the lid back on our mason jar and stopped drinking for a minute, and we paddled our boat right over next to that redwood tree and got up next to it, and I reached right over the side and I grabbed that fella right by the nape of the neck and pulled him into the boat. My golly, he was shivering to beat the band, just about half frozen. Well, I had to do the Christian thing. I took off my brand new winter jacket. I'd just gotten it from the Sears and Roebuck Catalog Company, brand new. Well, I gave it to him because he was sure a shivering. Well, you know, I did mention this was 1927 too, didn't I? That was right in the middle of Prohibition, and it was illegal to have a bunch of whiskey. But I always kept some just for emergencies such as this. Well, this fellow was shivering, so I turned around and get a pint out of my tackle box, and just as I turned around, this fella stands back up in the boat and jumps back in the river, wearing my coat. Well, I didn't have time to think about it, and I got to be honest with you, I wasn't trying to save his life. I wanted to get my coat back. I jumped in too. Oh my gosh, that water was so cold. I said, Ethan, throw me a rope. And he threw me a rope. And I held onto that rope, and I grabbed a hold of this fella, and he towed us ashore. Well, by the time we got to the bank, I hog-tied that guy up with 50 feet of rope with a knot that Harry Houdini couldn't have gotten out of. I guarantee you that. We didn't know what to do with this fella, so I sent Brother Ethan off to fetch the sheriff so he could figure out what to do with him. And in the hour or so it took to get back with the sheriff, I had a chance to sit down and talk to this fellow named Anderson and hear his story. And I gotta tell you, it's a common one, but a pretty frightful one. Turns out this Mr. Anderson had moved here from Norway a year earlier. He'd been hired to work out here in the woods, and his plan was to make enough money to send back for his true love, Miss Helga Peterson. You see, he talked real funny. I could hardly understand him, but he kept saying, Helga Peterson. That was his true love. Well, he was going to make enough money for her to send back to her so she could come over to Humboldt County and live with him happily ever after out here in America. Well, Turns out he'd just gotten a Dear Mr. Anderson letter that very day. And he'd gotten the bad news. She was not only not coming to America, she wasn't going to join him. In fact, she had just fallen in love with a young man who worked in a sardine packing plant. Imagine that, getting jilted by a fella who worked in a fish packing plant and smelled like sardines. Almost made sense he wanted to kill himself. Well, when Dr. Comfort arrived with the sheriff, they checked him out, and then directly they took him to Sequoia, which at that time was our county insane asylum. They took him off. Now here's the good part of the story. You see, by the time Ethan and I got back to Ronerville that night, we were being hailed as heroes. We had saved this guy not once but twice. Why, everybody in town wanted to hear that story, and I've got to tell you, I spent most of the night at the cafe telling that story 14 or 15 times. And I got to tell you, with every telling of that story, the water got a little bit colder, that swim got a little bit longer, and the virtue of my heroism, why, it just got bigger and better with every telling. Well, this went on for about 3 days, and I got to tell you, I was getting pretty used to being a hero. Even old Preacher Johnson over the Methodist Church called me a fine, upstanding Christian man that day. All this went on for about 3 days or so until they let that crazy Norwegian out of the county nut house. Well, you know, they say the third time's a charm. They'd given him enough money to buy a train ticket down to San Francisco, and they wanted to get him out of the county. Well, he took that money, he walked right down to the river, and he was found 2 days later, washed up on the bank. In fact, they buried him right over there in a pauper's grave, still wearing my coat.